the Bible. Oh, it's just this really big book with lots and lots of words, like pages and pages of words. So many words. I can't read all those words. But wait, what if you could read the stories of the Bible like a graphic novel? You know, not just a picture book, but movie-like visual storytelling on paper. Really compelling, really emotional, really cool looking. And what if it still had all the words, so you don't miss anything? If that sounds awesome to you, but you didn't know it existed, check out this interview with Simon Pillario, creator of Word for Word Bible comics. So, Word for Word Bible Comics offers historically accurate, unabridged, and untamed graphic novels of the Bible with a high view of Scripture. Wow, that sounds pretty good. But some of my listeners, you might not be familiar with the term graphic novel. So let me help you out there a little bit. First of all, it's important to understand graphic novel isn't a genre like fiction or nonfiction or science fiction. It's a format. So graphic novels can be all kinds of fiction or nonfiction, like history or certainly fantasy, science, anything in between. Any kind of literature can be done in a graphic novel format. And so graphic novels, they're kind of like comic books, thicker, right? Indeed, more like books, because they use sequential images to tell a story like a comic book does, but they aren't really like comic books because the stories they tell are usually self-contained within one or, sometimes more volumes, and then they have complex plots, but they're defined with an end and a beginning and an end. Word for Word Bible Comics presents books of the Bible in the format of a graphic novel. So the art and the style of art and the layout is really bold, very action-oriented, certainly not old-fashioned, but they do try very hard to be historically accurate. And they aren't really for kids, right? Now, rather than explain all of that myself, let's just go to the interview with the creator of Word for Word Bible Comics, Simon Pillario. I am here with Simon Amadeus Pillario, the creator of Word for Word Comics, and we want to hear about what Word for Word Comics are. And as we were having our little conversation before hitting the record button, Simon mentioned it's always good just to give an overview. So, Simon, what are Word for Word Comics? Tell us all about it.
Thanks for having me. So to get us started, I'll just tell you what they are. So with Word for Word Bible Comics, it's a graphic novel series which has every word included from the Bible. So each book, so for example, here you've got the Book of Ruth. It's got every word included from the Book of Ruth, chapter and verse, and nothing's missed out. The way it works is that the words that aren't needed, like he said and things like that, are included but in between the panels, and they're kind of subtle, so you don't need to read them, but you can read them if you want to, and all the sort of verses are in the corners. The second thing is it's untamed, because by not cutting out any of the scriptures or anything like that, with some of the more tricky books like Joshua and Judges, there are some bloody battles and adult themes that come into it. We don't skirt around those things or change them or water them down. So our books are not intended for little kids. They're intended for adults and sort of older teens, student age, that sort of thing. And lastly, it's historically accurate. So it's all the real places, the weapons and armor from the time period, and just trying to give, even the plants and animals are specific to the time period and the region, just to give you as clear a picture into the sort of time as possible. And with the pictures, it obviously gives you that extra element where you can show emotions and context and meaning. The idea is to just really help people to engage with and understand the text. So that's in a nutshell what it's all about.
I mean, I grew up with a comic book Bible. I couldn't even find the name of it, but I remember spending time as a kid just entranced by it. I spent lots of times, not what you did, much more cleaned up for sure. but I
Probably
but
the
I
picture
can still remember the
Bible.
image. Yeah,
It's probably the picture Bible, which came out in like the 70s or 80s or something, and
yeah,
it went, it's like in 140 languages now and stuff like that.
yeah, yeah. And it was a big deal. I mean, of course I'm a bookish person anyways, and I even was then, and I spent a lot of time with it. So yeah, so talk about your vision for a so the distinction you made was graphic novel, and I think that's important because we have a sense of that comic books are juvenile, and you're saying this is not necessarily juvenile, even though it's in that format. Talk about the need for that and how you came up with the concept.
So in regards to graphic novels, comics, I mean, the words tend to be relatively interchangeable. Technically, graphic novels have to be a certain sort of length, but comic is the generic term that it covers everything. But it depends on people's perception of what it means. It depends on their like age group and where they're from and stuff like that. So older generations, and like I was talking to an old lady who was a friend of my mum, and she like you were implying there, thought, oh, comic, that means it's silly, and she thought it was like satire or something.
Oh,
But no, but you have to use, but basically there's only really two words, comic or graphic novel, and you have to go with one or the other. And in Christian circles, comic might possibly be misconstrued as funny, but graphic is certainly the worst of the two if people misunderstand what that means. So we went with Bible comic, and generally people can see what it is. But how did it come about? Well, I became a committed Christian in my 20s. I did an Alpha course and got a
Alpha, good, yeah,
Bible. And I mean, I'd been in church and stuff as a child, and I sort of knew some of Bible stuff, but I picked up a Bible and basically read it to cover. And as I did, when you get through all the parts of the Bible where it's like Samuel and kings and stuff like that, where it's like this king and this priest made a political alliance and tried to oust these guys, and then they murdered them at a feast and stuff like that. And I was like, you never hear about any of this stuff. It's never preached on. It's never in any of the kind of kids programs that they make. I was like, someone should make a graphic novel or a TV show where they don't cut any bits out at all, and they just use it word for word. And it was not long after this that I felt God was just saying, well, you do it then. And so at that point, I was like, I don't even know if it's possible. So I started sketching it out and figuring out, because as I often say, if you were going to try and make a word for word adaptation of Lord of the Rings, it wouldn't work, right? Because there's so much description and blah, blah, blah.
yeah,
You can't do it. It'd be impossible. But with the Bible, it's like he went here and he said this to this person, and then they did this, and then they did this, and then he said that. And there's no description of anything. It's like it just bam, bam, bam. It's a shooting script, and it's very it lends itself very well to being converted into a comic. There's very few words that end up in the cut spaces, apart from, as I say, like he said, because you've got a speech
yeah,
bubble or something, you don't need it. But very few times is there actually a description or anything like that isn't needed. The Bible is, in a way, very economical with its words, so it worked in that way. So the first book that was produced is actually Judges, which is the new version is coming out in September. But that's because there's like superheroes almost in it, but
yeah,
we wanted to lean into that whole thing of it's not supposed to be for kids. When you read Judges, there's a lot of blood and betrayal and complex themes and adult stuff, and I was like, this is what I want to kind of expose, is this, like people who are like, oh, I don't read the Bible because it's Noah's Ark and laws and poems and stuff. I don't really want to read all that. But when they realize there's all these very real stories that contextualize the meaning of good and evil and God and that sort of thing, that's where I felt was the need. So that's where we started with Judges was the first one.
That's really interesting because I have deep deep memories as a kid being in Sunday school, reading about Samson, reading the Noah's Ark story, right, and the other stories of the judges and Gideon, and a lot of those guys, like Samson, was not a good guy, and yet he was held up as a hero, right, in
Yeah.
Sunday school because they have to, kind of polish it up for kids. But you didn't. Sounds like you left in a lot of the jagged edges.
Exactly, and that's actually one of my best examples. Is that Samson, the story of Samson and the judges in general. When you I'd love to tell this story to a kid, but can't have the prostitute, so we've got to cut that bit out, and we can't have him killing people out of hand for basically no reason, so we're going to cut that bit out, and then and then you cut it down. And what you come up with, so you present a small child in a Sunday school with a nice children's picture Bible, a story of Samson. The story that comes out though is God called Samson to do the things he asked him to, and then he gave him some sort of rules, but he broke the rules, and then God left him, and then at the end God kind of come back to him, and then he killed the Philistines. And so the moral of the story, small children, is that if you are good and you obey the laws, God will bless you. But actually the real story of Samson is, here's a guy who's called by God and given a bunch of laws. He then goes through and systematically breaks them all. He's a bad person. He goes off and he basically turns away from God, and then despite his promise, he screws it all up, but at the end he repents, and God uses him for his purposes. And so the point being, in spite of sin and how useless and terrible a mess up a person is, God can still use that person for his purposes, and they can repent and be forgiven. And so that's the gospel in Judges, right? There's a bunch of screw ups, and God uses them for his purposes. And so actually, by changing the story and taking out the prostitutes and stuff like that, you actually misrepresent the story and actually quite badly construe what the Bible is about and the message of that piece of scripture. So so that's why for us it's so important to keep every word, but to keep in all the warts and all, because they're there for a reason.
Right, and it treats those difficult stories and difficult passages as a feature and not a bug. Like they're in there for a reason. Yeah. So let's keep them in there. That must have been so when the interpretive act that you're really doing is figuring out how to interpret those words into pictures. And I can imagine that had a lot to do with why you started with Joshua and Judges, because in a way, those are very cinematic books. Lots, like you said, lots of action, lots of drama.
Yeah,
yeah,
that's true. I mean, in general, like you say, with a book like Judges or Jonah and things like that, we try to not interpret the scripture like it too much, right? We try to just literally present it as it's presented. Like if the scene is presented in a certain way in the text, that's the same way that we're trying to do it in pictures. We're not kind of adding extra scenes and and trying to explain stuff we're just kind of trying to show you what it's trying to show you and deliver the story to you in the same way that it's trying to deliver it to you, but with the pictures added so that you can see the kind of context, the historical setting and things like that. And sometimes that's very helpful. Jonah as an example, in Jonah, it's quite a short story and stuff, but one of the things that we do is like flavor is when people are speaking in different languages, like in Asterix, if you ever read that, they speak in different typefaces, right? So but I realized, Jonah obviously is a Hebrew person, but then he goes on the boat with a bunch of people who we don't know who they are, but they don't know who a Hebrew is, so they're definitely not Hebrews. but he can
Right.
speak to them, and they're probably Phoenicians, so he can speak Phoenician or whatever language they speak. And then he comes back, and then he goes to the king of, or the people, the everyday people in the street in Nineveh, and tells them a message. So he must be able to speak Assyrian as well. So he's he can speak three languages in theory, or else the whole story doesn't make sense, because he'd have real problems talking to the sailors, and then he wouldn't be able to deliver the message.
Right.
So it's
Right.
so actually, it's funny, because just by trying to do that silly thing with the typefaces, I realized, well, we look at Jonah's story, and we just sometimes we think, why didn't God just choose someone else? And he probably could have done. But it is interesting to think that
Yeah.
actually there probably aren't that many people who are a prophet and can speak three languages. So maybe God really did kind of, want Jonah to be the one, and that's why he was quite committed to getting getting him back on course with the sea creature.
I think it's so fascinating that what you just talked about, how you had to go through that. How do we communicate in imagery and even within the, if you will, the shape of the text, right? You're talking about different typefaces. How do we communicate what's going on? It's a very thoughtful process. Very cool. Talk a little bit about the historical research, because you mentioned that in your overview.
Yeah. So, I mean, basically, I tried to figure out, what part-time period is this, and what do the people look like? And so, I mean, one of the touchstones that people are very interested in a lot of the time is the ethnic thing, right? So, because obviously Jesus is not white, and nor are the other Jewish people, and Moses and all this stuff, they are Middle Eastern people, so they should look Middle Eastern, and so that is part of the thing that comes across. We're trying to portray the real people and then the real context. So in the Roman era, you've got like in Jesus' story, you've got Roman soldiers. Oh, what kind of Roman soldiers are they? What legion? What are they? And and then when you research it, it's like, well, although there possibly are some legionaries, most of them are going to be auxiliaries, so they would wear different
Right.
helmets and things like that. They'd have not as good. They wouldn't have the big plate stuff. They'd have the chainmail version, and they'd be non-Roman people. They'd be like local people who work for the Romans and this sort of thing, and there's shields of different shape. Auxiliaries got an oval shield, whereas the legionary has kind of the squarish shield, rectangular shield, and that sort of thing. So it's just trying to convey all these things. And one of the interesting parts about that is, with Judges, was the one we started with, and I said in a way why I wanted to start with that one. But I did start with that one, and actually it was a big blessing, because in regards to the Old Testament, it's a book where it's really hard to understand how all the time periods in Judges fit within the context of history, within the time period it's supposed to span. Even the internal logic of the Bible, it's like Solomon builds a temple and it's 480 years since this date, and you're like, oh, how does Judges fit in if that's only 480 years? And actually, by starting with Judges, which is timeline wise the most chaotic and difficult to interpret, having to nail that down first really helped, because if I'd have started with Moses and not done Judges, I might have put Moses in the wrong time period, if you know what I mean. And so I felt that God had led me to start with that. This is the historical sort of mess, to get it all together, and then you can figure out how all the rest of it fits in. So in Judges was tricky, because even as it is, it's a book that starts and then it finishes 250 years later. So they go from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age in one book. So you go through all these historical periods. Another example from that is at the start of the period, they have chariot wheels with 8 spokes, but by the end of the period, they have chariot wheels with 6 spokes, because it's like a technological advancement. So these sorts of things are like, being somebody who's passionate about history and having hobbies to do with history and things like that, I am very keen to make it right, to make it so that people, generally speaking, are like, that's right, because there's nothing worse than watching a film and being like, is that those arrows in that period? We don't have plate in that era, so.
Yeah, and we do tend to mush everything together. But if we stop and think about it, like you said, 250, right? 250 years ago, our warfare was massed muskets,
Yeah,
right? Bunches of people with muskets shooting at each other, and now you've got everything from nuclear weapons down to, Delta Force commandos, on a whole range of other things, tanks and all that kind of stuff. It's a lot of difference. It's
yeah,
and then you have different cultures too, like
yeah,
the Babylonians would have looked very different from the Medo-Persians, would have been different,
yeah.
probably, and they're probably different from the Canaanites and the Egyptians. So yeah,
Well,
that's
this is the thing, you read about all the different, especially in Judges and Joshua, all the different little tribes that they're talking about, and you can't
yeah,
visualize who they are or what differentiates them or anything. And sometimes you can't because they're just like this group is from a place that's only like 20 miles from that place, so they are basically the same. But with the Philistines, you might not realize when you read in the Bible, the Israelites are obviously like, people from Middle East or whatever. And then you've got the Canaanites. They're like the indigenous people of that sort of area as well. But then you've got Philistines. Well, they're actually a foreign invasion,
they're like
essentially. So they're
Greeks,
like
basically,
Greeks. Yeah.
Mycenaeans. Yeah, yeah.
They're Mycenaean Greeks who are coming across and basically trying to carve out a bit of land in the Levant. And so you can see it in their face. Do you know what I mean? Like they're not Middle Eastern. They are like essentially pretty much white, almost people who are coming across to conquer. But they have a very different style. Their clothes are completely different, and their weaponry, because like I say, they bring over the iron technology and all this stuff. So but getting to kind of see those things alongside with this text just being presented without it being like a respun, this is my imagination of how these events might have happened and that sort of thing. Just literally telling the story as it comes, trying to do it as faithfully as possible, but then being able to bring in those historical elements. It just, helps to visualize it, basically.
Where did you go for your historical data?
Well, as I often say, if I'd have started this project like 10 years ago,
Yeah,
even, it would have been really difficult because the internet just wasn't like, it is now. And I mean started it. So I did start it 10 years ago. So if I'd have started it 20 years ago, how the internet was then. But these days, you can, if you know sort of what you're looking for, because you've like got an idea, you can then start Googling very specific terms for things, so you can just say like Philistine pottery, late Bronze 2
wow,
era, and then it'll bring you up a bunch of stuff. And obviously you have to like look at it and then check it's actually it. But then you go, okay, this type of pottery, which is very distinctive, is late Bronze 2 Philistine pottery. So instead of drawing it all smashed up, I draw it in their hands all nice and together, and so the internet is just a very super powerful tool these days, and particularly because all the images are there and they're labeled up, and because I'm not using the image like itself, I'm looking at the image and copying it.
right.
There's no problem then with me, like, with
Copyright
and all that stuff. Yeah, it's just like, oh, that's what it looks like, so that's what I'll draw. So I'm able to put those things together. And the same with landscapes. You go, oh, this battle happens like Deborah and Barak. It's like at the foot of the Mount Tabor in the Jezreel Valley, and then they have the battle. But then you get to Gideon, and you're like, oh, wait a minute, he's on Mount what's it called, Minna or something. That's basically the one that's just opposite the other one. So actually, this battle is happening in the same place. It's not clear from the text because it's a different mountain in the same place, but they, this is the valley where they're having this battle. And then, it's also where Megiddo is. So it's also the same place that you're going to have the battle, in Battle of Armageddon and stuff like that. But it's also a place where Nazareth is on a cliff which overlooks it and stuff like that. So all these places are all super connected to each other. And as you draw them out, but yeah, you can find images then of those mountains or valleys and things like that.
And it occurs to me, even I've been to Israel way back when I was a young man, and you could certainly look now and see the contours. The contours are probably similar to what they were then, but places that were forest then are not forest now, and places that were deserted then, maybe cities now, and different,
Yeah.
to make those adjustments. Good on you. Do you do all that research yourself, or do you have people that help you? Do you have scholars that you go to kind of verify, or how do you do that?
I do both. So basically, I do the research, but when I hit something, I'm like, with historical research, what it is, it's like sometimes you'll run into a subject and then you'll find that everybody agrees and there's literally no dispute about this at all. But a lot of the time, you'll find something, and sometimes you like there's two or three different ideas and they're quite clearly defined, and you're like, okay, these are the three different ideas. And sometimes you're like, nobody knows, and that's when you actually have to do loads and loads and loads of research. You're like, I have to make sure that actually no one knows this. Like, I can't because if that happens, I have to kind of make something up that seems right because nobody knows what this looks like. So you have to kind of design the this tribe or whatever. So I have to be quite sure that nobody knows. But nowadays I have two historical experts who are like, one's a professor and teaches in Cardiff, and one lives in the Middle East, and he's a British person, but he's a doctorate in history. And both of them have written numerous books about various topics that are relevant. And so when I've got a question, I can go to them and say, am I right in thinking this is the thing? And then in general, I get them to read through the books before they're published. So I just did Song of Songs, and Mark, he was like, you've done a door with a curved top, an arched top, but that's not period. So then I had to go. Still haven't done it. I have to go back and change the top of the door so that it's a square door, not a round door.
There's so much that we take for granted. We don't realize that it wasn't always like this.
Yeah.
Or what we thought it was. That's really interesting. That's one of the things. Again, when I ran across you in a Facebook ad you were running for a Kickstarter. Yeah. This is how you've been funding and going along. Would you explain that to people? Because I think there are a lot of people that don't know what a Kickstarter is, or why you would ever do it. But go ahead and explain how you're funding and developing your project.
Well, the Kickstarter you're referring to, we just, as we record this, it finished on Sunday, recording on Tuesday, so it's like 2 days ago it finished. But like most of your listeners, perhaps they're thinking, what is Kickstarter? I don't know. I also, when before I did one, I didn't know what it was. I think a lot of people do know what it is now, but at the time it was sort of up and coming. And so yeah, I didn't know what it was, and I was with some friends, and they were like, "Oh yeah, I bought this game on Kickstarter, and it's going to come in a few months' time, blah blah." And then I was like, "What's that?" And they explained it. And so basically, what it is Kickstarter in general is a person can have an idea for something that could be made or designed, or a comic book or whatever, and they think, "I want to." And it's invent things or games or whatever. They're like, "There's a demand for this thing that I've thought of, but I don't have any money. However, I've put some initial kind of plans together. Here you go, have a look. I need some money to make it happen." If you so with a book, you say, I'm going to make this book. If you buy the book before it's made, and then you can wait a year, I'm going to make the book with the money you gave me, and then you're going to get it in a year's time. But it also means it's created. So it's called crowdfunding, but by being people who are willing to kind of basically back stuff and put some money behind things that are like in concept, it means that people like myself are able to kind of get a little bit of money together to make it happen, and then they can like publish the book. So that was how we took it. So I'd already drawn the story of Samson, and then I found out about Kickstarter, and I said this is what we should do. I should do a Kickstarter and see how it goes. So I did one, and that was our first one, and that was 2011. I think.
How did that go? I mean, I know when I look at Kickstarters, one of the things I look at is what their goal is, and then what they've actually raised. Right? I think I find that really interesting. How did that go for you, the first one?
Well, the first one was for judges, and we sat down and we said, how much money do we really need at minimum to make it happen? And I was like, I think it's going to take like a year or maybe a year and a half. But, we don't want to ask for too much sort of money. So, but we decided 15,000 was like hopefully enough to pay.
And is
for it
that
to happen.
euros? You were dealing with euros?
In pounds, and pounds aren't
Pounds.
too far
Okay.
off dollars at the moment.
Right.
So it's about like, it's like $19,000-$19,000.
Mm.
And I put it up, and obviously the first one, it was mostly, but not all, people who I sort of know, people from my church, some family members and things like that. But so they're about a month long, and with that one, it was 10 days before the end, and we got it just to roughly half, and I was like, oh, it's it's not gonna happen. We've got another 10 days to raise more than we've already raised, and we've already burnt out all the people we thought we could, and I was in church, and I was sort of praying about it, and they were playing the worship, but the drum was doing this marching sort of sound. It was just the drum, and people were praying, and I just felt God was saying, like, this is like a battle which you don't think is possible to win, but I'm asking you to do it. So just keep putting one foot in front of the other, and and keep going. And so I was like, all right, I'll just keep going. There's no promise they will work out. Just keep going. That's the thing. So I kept going. And then in the last 6 days, it went up by like £12,000. So it's like, and it got funded and overfunded. And that meant that I was able to, quit my day job and start working on it full time.
Nice.
And it was just, really, really good. And Kickstarter is one of these things that sometimes people do it at the start, and then they get the money, and then you imagine, oh, I'm going to get the money, and then I make the books, and then the books are going to sell, and I'm going to make, and that's fine. I'll never need to do a Kickstarter again. But the reality of making comics is they're not a massive money spinner, and
Right.
so when it came to like the second book, we're like, well, maybe we should do another Kickstarter, see how that goes. And we did another one, and after I'd done the second one, I met some people when I was at an event who backed it and stuff, and they're like, oh, you should do it, I hope you'll do a Kickstarter for every book, because when you do a Kickstarter, you give people special stuff, like, these are the first ones, these are signed, these are special in some other way, and you get stickers and badges and bits and bobs that you won't get otherwise. It's unique for backers. So basically we've done a Kickstarter for every book, because it just really people love the excitement of the raising the money, and then you add extras and things like that with stretch goals, so people have really enjoyed it. But what I was originally going to say was, setting a goal at 15,000 is actually sort of crazy, because in comics most of them are like a couple of thousand. So most people would only ask for a couple of thousand for like the print, or like 3,000-4,000. But yeah, so not many of them actually start at that high.
Yeah,
So
but I think what you're doing is unusual even among the graphic novel, because it's not all springing just out of your head. You're trying very hard to ground it in two things: in actual history and in a particular text that needs to be understood. So it's a different kind. Oh, great! I have a phone ringing. Excellent. Never heard to numb those before I do an interview. So it would take. It's perfectly understandable to me why that would take longer to do.
Yeah.
And more effort.
Yeah. Well, it's a full-time job, so gradually it's built. I mean, so as I say, 2011 was the Kickstarter.
And how did the one for Song of Solomon end? Did you fully fund that?
Yeah, so that was the one we just did. Now, for people's reference, we set the goal pretty low on that one for 5,000. It's quite a short book anyway, and we did get some marketing help, which is why you saw an advert. But it over exceeded its goal, and it got to £21,700, which is probably 24 or something $1,000.
Of course, the brilliant thing about that is not only does it allow you to produce it, and that's the main reason you did it, but it also is kind of like a reverse marketing research. It tells you that there's a market for it, even though you're not going to necessarily get rich on the selling of the product. There is a market for it. People do want it if they'll support it to that level. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's just a case of being heard of. Gradually, you need people to have heard of your product, your book, because it that's the battle. When people hear about us, they get a copy, and generally people give us amazing reviews, and our Amazon sort of account thing would bear that out. That pretty much all our books have got mostly 5 stars, like 4.7 and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's just a case of being heard in this world where there's so many Facebook ads and billboards and movies and watch this, watch our streaming service and buy our books and blah, blah. It is a lot of competition, so it's hard. But we're essentially just in it for the long haul. So gradually we've built up. So we got an American distributor now. We have had for the past 2.5 years. So they've released the sort of 6 of the titles so far, and they produce we release 3 a year through them, and that's it's growing gradually, a month on month. You see more and more sort of orders, and then we do the Kickstarters, which are growing as well. And then we're trying as well to get the books into other languages. We've got agents, so we produced ourselves some of the books in Spanish.
I saw the Spanish.
Yeah. And so they look the same, but it's called Verso Biblia Comic. So
hold it more up in the center. I'm not seeing all of it. There you go. This is what. Yeah. There you go.
And it means verse by verse Bible comic. So it's obviously a similar sort of name. But yeah, it's just the same thing with the Spanish translation. And then we've got Portuguese, which we've sold to a publisher in Portuguese, and they're supposed to be releasing it in May. But looking forward to getting others as well. So, I mean, obviously we're doing a Bible Society podcast. So if there's people hearing this who like, our Bible Society in our country would like to do this, they can obtain the rights and produce it with whatever Bible translations they've got rights to or can obtain, and can license it and produce it themselves and make it into the other languages. We're really, really keen for them to go into just lots and lots of different languages.
Well, I'm going to be ordering a few copies of different things to hear. We have a little Bible resource center. New Hampshire is a very small state in the northeast of the U.S. 1.3 million people total. I mean, there are cities that have more people than we have, and historically has very very secular. Probably actually of the locations in the United States, we're probably religiously very similar to Great Britain in that sense. In terms of we're just a very secular region of the country. But we go back a ways and have been doing this for ways, and we're trying to kind of find ways to help people re-engage with the Bible, or if they're just curious about the Bible, but they're not quite sure how to approach it. I want to have some of these on hand for people that will give them a nice intro into it at our little resource center that we have here in our state, in our church where we're located. But yeah, so there'll be some of those available. Talk to me a little bit about. So I went on your website, and you kind of, before we started the recording, you let me know that what I'm seeing on the website is just what's available in the United States, but you have some other things that are still available in Great Britain, right? And I guess in Europe maybe. I don't know how Brexit has affected you as far as distribution goes. But I noticed that you had Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which made total sense to me, because whenever I'm reading the Bible with some new person or new believer or exploring person, I'm always starting with the Gospels. Because, let's just start with Jesus and see where that goes. And then, it's not, let's start with Genesis, because that just people, it's hard for a person who doesn't to find that as an entry point. Right. So I appreciate that. And then, of course, we talked about Joshua and Judges as just very cinematic and problematic, which is, I think that's very cool that you did it. And then doing Song of Songs. I'm like, as I said before, that's a bold choice, brother. That's a bold to go with that. So talk about how you've been making those choices as to what you'd start with and what's coming up next.
Okay, just to complete your list, in the US, you should also be able to get Joshua and Jonah. And on our website, if people scroll down further, you can buy the other books from us in the UK, and you just pay if the shipping across from the UK. But yes, there's also Esther. And Judges, but Judges is coming out, as we said, in the US in September
Very,
anyway. So
very compact stories, kind of self-contained.
yeah, and there's also the Christmas one. I don't think, actually, that's not for sale there. We did a Kickstarter for that. That's our Christmas one, but it's just got all the bits from the Christmas stories from the different Gospels pushed together in a chronological order. So it's a slightly different. That's why it's got a purple rather than our standard color. But it's because one day, once we've done all the Gospels, we hope to do a chronological Gospel where you just go through all the various. It's all together. Yeah, but in regards to Song of Songs, that was one that we did recently. I did a survey a while back on our Facebook group. So if people want to come and join the Facebook group, I do a lot of questions to people about this sort of thing, and people can give their opinion on covers and various designs and bits and bobs. I said, like, what book do people actually really want to see? Like, what book are people like really waiting for? The top one ever, if you could choose. I thought it might be Revelation or something, but it was actually Acts. So I was like, oh, okay, people really want to see Acts. That was their top choice, like by vote. And I was like, well, if I'm going to do Acts, I probably need to do Luke. So that was before I did Luke. So I did Luke, and then now currently I'm working on Acts. Nice. I wanted a short book to go between them because Acts is very long, right? So the various books are different lengths. So like Ruth is like only a few chapters, and Jonah's only a few chapters, but like Luke and Luke is the
35 years. People don't realize Luke spans 35 years of time.
What exactly? But also, like, it's a lot of text. So this is the Luke one, and it's like 278 pages or something like that. I forget, but that's our longest book. Anyway, but I wanted to do a short one. Anyway, I was at an event. So we go to a men's event, and Christian men's event. And it's happened before, but it happened quite a lot this particular time last year. And so I explained to people, it's historically accurate and it's aimed at adults and teens. And some of the books have an advisory of 15 plus. And then the blokes often go, you should do Song of Songs. And I'm like, and so basically it happens so often. And I was sitting there with my friend, who is essentially a friend through the project, because he often sees me at events, and now he's sitting there beside me by my desk thing. And I said to him, do you know what? I think I actually might. Like, people have said it so often as a joke. I mean, it is a joke, but they also are thinking it would be a really tricky one to do, and it's very sexual. So how are you going to do that? So I was like, actually, do you know what? I think I might. So I went away and I figured out, is it viable? Because some of the books are going to be really difficult to do. But actually, as I read it and researched it and tried to figure out because it's not all, but of many of the books of the Bible, when you read that one, perhaps it is the most difficult to actually understand what it's talking about. It's so full of idioms and who's talking and what do they mean by this and what's the context. So there's no context, there's no like he said, she said. And in fact, of all our books, it's the book where there's nothing in the gutters, because there's literally no text at all dropped out of it. But and then I watched a bunch of preachers and commentaries and and people and this is an example of where there's three main views, like I was saying earlier, and and I was like, okay, and so I researched it and read all the commentaries and read various people trying to convince me this view is right. But and what was the point? And my point is that you listen to a preacher and they're like, this is a story and this is the meaning of the story. There's a girl and she's a poor sort of common girl, and then the king comes, but he's in disguise as a shepherd, and then they meet and they fall in love, and she doesn't know he's the king. So it's like, pure love, and then there's a bit of turmoil, and then they get engaged, and then he goes away, But when he comes back, he comes with this ceremony, and it's a royal carriage, and all this, and then they go to Jerusalem, and they're married, and then they consummate their marriage, and then they talk about going away together, and they have a party and stuff. But you read the book, you're like, how are they getting all this detail? But as I drilled down into it, I was like, oh, that's why they're saying it. Oh, that's the reference to her being poor. That's what it means. Oh, and it talks about places. Oh, blah blah blah. This person, or they call somebody by a place name and things like that. What? Because it's so hard to understand, because you don't live in that culture, you don't know the places.
Yeah.
But when you understand the context, like, okay, so that's why she is poor, because she comes from this place and she's working the fields and I started it as a joke or whatever, but I was like, actually, of all the books, this one has benefited the most from having a consistent visual storyline where you can actually clearly see what's happening and what they're talking about because of the context, because you can see who's speaking and to whom. And even though there's love and all this in it, some of the verses, when you read them, you're like, oh, this seems like they're talking explicitly about lovemaking. But in its context, you're like, actually, they are sort of alluding to that, but that's not what's like happening in the story. That they're talking about the fact they would like to. So you don't have to draw them having like lovemaking, because they're just saying that they would like to. So I've done it in such a way that it is like a tiny bit like risque, and there's a lot of innuendo in there and things like that, and you can't get around the fact that there's verses, like he's like,
right,
your stature is a palm tree, your breasts are the fruit, I'd like to climb that tree and lay hold of that fruit. It's like, that is literally what he means. I mean, that is what he means. There's no two ways around it. But he's saying it as like a sort of a joke, like, it's not, you don't have to draw anything sexual. He's sort of because the whole thing is like a poem, a song. He's saying they're kind of, it's like it's a funny thing to sing in front of other people, and that makes them feel a bit awkward, and it's like a joke. So that's how it's like portrayed.
I don't know if you're familiar with the Bible Project out of
yeah,
and they talk a lot about how the Bible is meditation literature, and how you're supposed to be able to take these imagery and these things that are being said and just think about it, just ponder it. What's going on here? Because there's layers of meaning, and that's on purpose, right? So it's not all about just the making love. It's about, what does it mean? What are the layers of meaning? It's not all about just a king and a young woman. It's who are these representing? Who can they represent? So
exactly.
I'm really curious to see what you did with that, because it's I can see what you're saying by that would lend itself to
there's two things to say there, and that is that as I say, there's three interpretations, and one is that it's just not a narrative. That's pretty straightforward. Another is that there's the two-person narrative, which I described, and the third is that there's a three-person narrative, that there's a common girl and a shepherd. They're in love, but then the king comes along and tries to take her away, and that she's like, come and get me, my love, and then at the end they run off together. But in the fullness of Scripture, it works better with the two-person thing, in my opinion. Even though one of my Bible experts kind of didn't agree, and we talked about why don't you agree, and what are the verses you use to sort of justify the fact you don't agree. But the fact that there's a woman who's the bride, and then the bridegroom comes the first time as a poor person, who then goes away and leaves her alone for a while, and then comes back and he's the king, and they are married. So in the fullness of Scripture, this is the idiom which they're building, and Jesus says about, the volume of the book is written of me and stuff. This is the point of why it's the Song of Songs. It's the song, the best song ever. It's a prophetic song which points to the coming of Jesus and the second coming, and that's my position. But because it's an interpretation of Scripture and other people don't agree, in the books that we do, at the back we often have articles, and so I do in the articles lay out, this is other people's positions and this is why they think it, and and
Yeah.
this is why I don't agree with it. But
You had to pick a line. You had to pick a line to
yeah,
go.
exactly. And on that one, I had to choose one and go for it. But at the end, I get to then deconstruct it and say, this is why I thought that, but other people believe this.
That's good. I appreciate that. There's a lot of integrity in that approach, so that's very cool. Before we kind of wrap it up, I want to just talk about one more thing. You have a relationship, obviously, now with Biblica. Biblica used to be, just for, as a Bible Society guy, I got to bring this in. Biblica used to be the New York Bible Society, and then became the International Bible Society, because New York is the international city, in the United States. So I understand that. And now they've rebranded as Biblica, and they are the publishers of the new international version of the Bible, which is the text that you have adopted, not apparently one you started out with, but the one that you adopted as your English text. Talk about how that came about, and talk about that.
So how did it come about? So chronologically, we started out, and I was planning to do the NIV from the start, actually. So some of the books pages were created initially with NIV. As we did the Kickstarter, and then we got time to publish, and time was running out. I was praying, God, we need a translation, and there's difficulties kind of obtaining them and stuff like that. I don't have any permissions currently, but we kind of need to publish. I had to say, like, God, if you don't, help me find someone by this date, I'm going to just have to publish with the World English Bible. Now, the World English Bible, there's literally nothing wrong with it apart from one thing. It's really good. It's a modern day translation of the American Standard Version, which is a brilliant translation. Mm-hmm. It's very word for word, and it's an excellent translation. The only problem it has is nobody's heard of it, and therefore they don't know if it's a heresy or not. And so Christian people are very like, oh, I don't know about that Bible and stuff, because ultimately there are translations out there that are bad. So if you've not heard of it, you don't know if it's good or bad, you might want to steer clear. We went with it anyway. And so the first books were all published in that. We were very keen to obtain a proper, well-known translation, and I like the NIV, even though it has its detractors, which perhaps we will talk about in a minute. Another one, of course, is the ESV. So I managed to so I go to these events, which are like industry events, and you can actually talk to some of the head people in various companies. And so I managed to track down one of the people who's on the permissions board for the ESV, who had already said no once. In fact, they had said no twice. They said no when I asked them. Then there was a publisher who was looking at potentially taking us on, and they asked them, and they said no. Then I asked him face to face, and he said okay, and I explained it to him, and he's like, I see your point of view. I'll take it back to them, and then they said no again. So it was just a closed door. ESV was not going to happen. I was keen on the NIV, but early days, I got permission from Hodder. Now, Hodder and Soughton own the rights in the UK and Europe to produce the NIV. The thing with NIV is, as you said, Biblica created the NIV as a sort of, charitable Christian thing, making a good Bible translation. But it's so successful that they basically sublet the license, so that in America and Canada, it's Zondervan who control the rights. Right. And then in Europe, it's Hodder for UK and Europe. But Biblica own all the rest of the world. So the upshot is you need permission from all three entities if you want to make a worldwide sale, international sale. So I already had Hodder because I met the person, and he'd agreed, and we all got to the point of signing. And this was early days before I did the World English Bible. I was like, but when we came to signing, I was like, yeah, but I need to produce in the USA. So I assume what we can do is put an addendum on the contract, which would extend through your partners in the US, that I'll pay them for their bit and stuff like that. He was like, no, they were like, no, you've got to approach them separately and get the agreement separately from them. and so it just all fell through, and that was at the beginning. But then I went to this event, and there was a guy from Biblica on a different stand, and it was an event where randomly it wasn't very well sort of attended, so a lot of the people on the stands were like hanging around, chatting to each other. And I explained to him how I had problems with getting hold of the NIV, and then he was like, let me help you. And so he went to the head of Biblica licensing and said, this person wants to use it, we should let them. So he was like, yeah, okay. And I was like, can you put me in touch with the Zondervan person? So instead of going through the applications program, I went straight from the person at the top to the person at the top on the other end. And they were like, oh, okay, we'll look at it. And he was like, yeah, okay. But then he's like, here's the contract for America. And it has all this stuff that's like, you can only have the words in 2 columns or 1. you can't remove the numbers or change the punctuation or remove any words or anything like that. And I'm like, this is not going to work. Like, the contract as it stands won't let me adjust the text. But the thing is, even though we keep every word, technically we change the punctuation, because where there's a comma, sometimes we put a ... because there's another speech bubble. So there's 2 speech bubbles connected by a ... Now, as a reader, that means the same thing as a comma, right? But technically you're changing the punctuation. So I had to write up this style sheet saying, look, when there's a comma, sometimes we do this. And then when people shout, it's going to be in caps, which is not in the Bible, and blah, 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 blah. And I showed my wife, and she was like, if they agree to this, it'll be a miracle. Because he was like, I'm going to have to take it to the committee, and they're going to have to agree to it. But in the end, they were like, yeah, we agree to that. And so that got signed off. So it was Zondervan, tick, Hodder, tick, Biblia, tick. And
so they understood, really what happened is they understood the difference in the medium between a textbook and a graphic novel. They understood the difference in what's needed there. And that
the guy there, he just said, right, I'm going to authorize it, and because you're supposed to, you have to show it to them before you publish it anyway and stuff. So
I'll just say, I'm glad you went with the NIV. I know the ESV is very popular. My thing, like your thing, is making graphic novels. My thing is reading the Bible out loud, and I just love the way the NIV reads aloud. So I like that.
It's the modern language version, which I feel has the most sort of natural sort of language in it. Because even though like things like the Message try to be even more natural, they then I go too far, and you're like, well, that's not how people talk. And it's like, but and the Message obviously is super dynamic and stuff, so it's like not very, you can't say, oh, this is word for word. It's the Message. So we wanted one that people know. Now, NIV has a lot of detractors, right? People are like, oh, I don't like the NIV. The NIV misses out verses, and particularly, people who really love the King James and stuff like to say, oh no, it's terrible. The NIV has verses missing and stuff like that. And it's like that. The more you learn about why they're not there, you're like, oh, because of these reasons for the actual source text, they're not just being pulled out. But B, they're generally speaking, they're not pulled out because it says like a little thing, and then at the bottom it says something, include this verse. So you're like, so it's not cut out; it's just in a little appendix. So I don't have any problem with it, and I think most people who really don't like it don't really understand the argument against. Why people argue against it. But it's a vocal minority, as always. It's like as people who scream and shout about the fact that the NIV is terrible, and yet it's the most popular, most best-selling English language version.
Right. Yeah, you're right. I think it's people don't understand how translation works is part of it. They don't understand what goes into it, and we'll be doing episodes on that kind of thing. Because the biggest question one of the biggest questions is, how do I choose, a good translation? And so we're going to have guests, talking about that. I'm not an expert on those kinds of things. I'm just an amateur, but I know people, so we'll be talking about those kind of things.
Well,
we have now run a bit over our 50 minutes. We've gone over. So I want to wrap up with this. If someone wants to get a word-for-word Bible, or how do they buy it? How do they learn more about it? Where do they go? How do they get in touch with you?
The simplest answer is to just go to our website, and it's quite easy to remember, wordforwordbiblecomic.com. But from there, they can find, if we're running a Kickstarter, there'll be a link to there. If, we've got a newsletter, we do once a month update. So if you're interested in what we're doing, sign up to that. It's just 12 emails a year, but it'll notify you about the Kickstarters and special deals and Christmas stuff and all this stuff. So there's that, but also all our social, we're very active on like Facebook and things like that and Instagram. So you can use the website to just click through and follow us there. And it means, on the Facebook group, as I say, you can get involved. You can give your opinion on what book should I do next? And I put out the covers. I say, here's like 5 different versions of the covers, which people like. And then I'll take the one that people like the best, and then I'll do a couple of versions of those. And then I'll say, which one of these do you like the best? And then that's how we develop the covers, because it's so important to get the cover right. And people help and they give their opinion so that you can be part of that.
That's great. So it's Word for Word Comics or comics?
No, Bible Comics.
Bible Comic. Word for Word
BibleComic.com.
BibleComic.com. Word for Word, spelled out. Word, FOR.
Yeah.
Word. BibleComic.com. Right.
But again, if you Google it, it'll come up.
Yeah.
So.
Just wanted to make it easy for them to get it. So, folks, if you're listening to this, if this sounds interesting to you, definitely go on and buy some stuff. If you want to support them, get on their newsletter. That's free. Just sign up for the newsletter, and they'll keep you posted about the next Kickstarter and the next project they're doing. You can support them up front. This is a project that I think needs a lot of support, deserves a lot of support. So get on board. Thank you, Simon, for your time. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you very much for having me. Cheers.
So here is what I really love about Word for Word Bible Comics. You see, I'm a huge fan of reading the Bible out loud. But I don't mean just flatly intoning the words in a pseudo-pious drone. I mean reading in a way that really clarifies the text and emphasizes the main ideas. The kind of reading that evokes the emotions that are in the text, even the action of the text. And I think these Word for Word Bible Comics, they try to do very much the same thing that I'm trying to do with my voice, but Simon's doing it graphically, with images, rather than the audio of the human voice. And I think with the help of these images, you may perceive things that are in the text, but that otherwise you might have missed. So, man, definitely go to the website, or go to your preferred bookseller, look up Word for Word Bible Comics, and buy some of them. Take them for a test drive. Share them with your friends if you like them, and see how reading a graphic novel version of the Bible can really enhance your understanding of the text. Let's definitely support Simon and his work, because he is both an artist and a minister of the good news of Jesus, and we need to support him in the work to which God has called him. Well, congratulations. You have managed to listen to another whole episode of Hello Bible. Sincerely, I want to thank you. And if you think we merit it, please go ahead and leave us a positive review, 5 stars on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast app you use to feed your habit. If you have not already done so, definitely follow or subscribe so you can keep up with new episodes as they come out. If you are watching on YouTube, be sure to smash both that like and the subscribe button, because, we can't just click on anything anymore. We have to smash them. And be sure to share this episode with your friends and with a bunch of people you don't know very well, and especially with all of your worst enemies. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, and at our website, www.biblenh, all one word, biblenh.org. Hello Bible is a podcast production of the New Hampshire Bible Society, a nonprofit organization that partners with churches all over New Hampshire to help them engage with the Bible, cultivate and encourage discipleship of Jesus Christ. And because New Hampshire is definitely a mission field, the least religious state in the whole country, we have supporters from all over the place who want to support us as a mission. If you'd like to support gospel ministry in New Hampshire through the New Hampshire Bible Society, go to BibleNH.org/support. Hey, grace and peace to you all. Let's do this again soon.